Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm super happy to be here. It's my second time in Amsterdam, and I'm absolutely enjoying it. I think it's like my favorite city, right? Must be your favorite city as well, right? Yeah? Woohoo! Cool. So today we're going to talk about PWAs. And my name is Simona Cotin, and I work as a cloud developer advocate, just like Sarah. I work with Sarah at Microsoft. And basically, my role there is to kind of make sure that JavaScript is a first-class citizen in the cloud. And if you have any questions about Microsoft Azure or JavaScript or Angular, do reach out on Twitter at Simona_Cotin. I'm there to answer your questions. So this talk is actually a form of a lot of selfishness from my side. Because as you can see in this picture, a lot of people would think that developer advocates are partying a lot. And some other people would think that we're actually burning through a lot of money. But what we actually do is spend a lot of time in airplanes, and also on trains, on our way to the airport, and also in very fancy hotels. But the thing that's really, really not good is the internet speed. So it happens so many times that I'm just like, I picked this hotel which is absolutely amazing, and then for some reason, the internet speed is just incredibly slow. And one of the things that might happen is the night before a conference like this, where you have a huge amount of people just looking at you, you kind of feel very nervous about the demos that you're building and the slides that you have, and you feel like tweaking everything, and then, bam, the internet is not helping you. So in a way, I started looking into progressive web apps because I want the internet to be a progressive web app. And what we're going to look into today is basically an intro to PWAs, understand which are the main concepts in progressive web apps, look into how you can use Angular to implement progressive web apps, and also like some of the tools that might help you and some success stories that will inspire us. So what are progressive web apps? Well, they're basically web applications that are regular web pages or websites, but can appear to the user like traditional applications or native mobile applications. And another definition, which I much rather prefer, is they're just websites that took all the right vitamins. And this comes from Alex Russell. Have you guys heard of Alex Russell? Yeah? For those of you who haven't, he's a Google developer, and he's actually one of the people that coined the progressive web apps term. Alex and his wife were having dinner, and they were passionately talking about the web, and they came up with this progressive web app term, and they also came up with a list of things that a progressive web app should be. And so one of the first things on their list was that a progressive web app should basically represent an enhancement in the user experience. So the more a user uses an app, the better it feels and the more engaged with that app he is or she is. And that means that you get even like pop-ups like add this to your home screen and a lot of other things. Also, your progressive web app should be responsive, which means that it should fit any kind of form. It should work, and it should look good in a browser, on a tablet, on a desktop, or even on a mobile. It should be connectivity independent. Woohoo! It should definitely work even when you're offline or when there's like the connection is spotty. It should be app-like, which means that you should be able to navigate just like you do in a traditional native app. You should have that kind of experience, the full screen experience, fully immersive. It should be fresh, so there should be updates whenever we're back online. We should have a process in the background that will update our content. It should be safe, because we don't want like the third, like the man in the middle attack. We don't want our content to be tampered with. We should be able to search, to Google search, or to use a search engine that will be able to find our application. Re-engageable, which means that the things that we love, like push notifications, those should happen not only in the native apps, but also when we have progressive web apps. And then they should be installable. You should be able to, once you're basically using an app multiple times, for example, Twitter Lite, right? My app should show me that, oh, you can install this application. Feel free to add it to your home screen. And finally, I think that's very, that's the web, right? We have a URL for every resource out there, and our app should be linkable. I should be able to share a link to my app with Sarah. And if we were to put all these words in a word cloud that's very specific to the front-end love theme, this is how it would look like. So how do we get started with this? Well, there's this thing called the baseline appiness, and these are the main requirements that we have for bare-bone progressive web app. And the first thing we need is a service worker that will help us to deliver content even when we're offline. And then we need a web manifest that will be a description of our app, and it will enable us to install the app on the home screen. And all of this needs to be delivered over HTTPS because we want to be secure. So service workers, web manifest, and everything under HTTPS. So let's dive a bit into what are service workers. Well, they're basically proxies that sit between the web page and the network. And then they kind of control whether your application will receive content from the cache, or they will go ahead and request data from the network. So if we were to look at the actors in this, so we have the web page, and then we have the service worker sitting on the same side as the web page, which might request data from the backend, but also it could use the cache. So from a request and response perspective, the web page, like we have a request, and then the server thinks about it, the service worker thinks about it, and it works really hard, like what should I do with this? And then it decides to go back to the backend and retrieve the data from there. And then we get the response and send that back to the web page. And the other scenario is where we're actually deciding to go to our cache, retrieve data from there, and return it to our web page. And one of the first steps when working with service workers is registering our service worker. And it's just as simple as basically calling the register method on the navigator object in the browser. And we're sending as a parameter the URL of the service worker. But before we're doing that, because we have multiple types of browsers, we have to check whether our browser supports service workers or not. And the service worker has two characteristics. One of them is it has a scope, which is basically what domain does it, where it has control, and then a lifecycle, which allows us to tap into certain methods. So the default scope here, when we're registering the service worker, is the current scope, the current folder relative to where our service worker is defined. And this means that, for example, if we were to have a service worker at xwz.serviceworker/work, then that's where our service worker will listen for requests and all the subdomains of that. And the scope of a service worker is completely separated from the scope of our web page, which means that inside a service worker, we cannot actually modify the DOM or do any of that kind of work. They're two separate things. Lifecycle, well, it starts with us registering the service worker, and then the service worker gets installed, and that's where we might decide to cache some assets. And then from there, if it hasn't, if there might be an error, and that just means that we'll retry to install, or it might get active. And that's where we decide whether we want to update some of the data that we have already cached or not. And then it's going to listen to fetch events, or it's going to decide to basically I'm going to maybe spare some memory now, and I'm not going to do anything. And if we were to look at code, this is how it looks like. So we can listen to the install method, and then we can maybe cache one of our assets, or we can listen to activate and log something or do something there. And when we're fetching, we can intercept that method, that event, and decide whether to give back the cached asset or just whatever. So if you're wondering about the support of service workers, well, it's fully supported in Firefox and Chrome, and then it's in development in Edge and Safari, which is great news. And then it's also fully supported in Chrome for Android and Samsung Internet. So now if we think back of the list of 10 characteristics of progressive web apps, by just adding service workers, what we managed to do is achieve connectivity independency, freshness, and our app is now discoverable. So the next step is implementing a web app manifest, which basically provides information about an application, like the name, the author, the icon, and the description. And the purpose is really to install web applications to the home screen. And this is how it looks like. It's a JSON object that gives us information like what's the short name, and that's what's going to show like on your screen when you've installed the application. That's what you're going to see. And then the icons that you might use when installing that app. And the start URL is basically what URL are we going to use when we're starting this application. And the cool thing here is that you can define query parameters, which allow you to track analytics. So in this case, you're going to be able to find out how many people have used your application from their home screen. And things like the standalone, like display standalone, will just make you the full give you the full screen experience. So now we've added to our list installable, and then we have to make sure that we serve our service workers or everything via HTTPS, and then we're also safe. And this is the main things that we need to make sure that we're implementing. Everything else, like push notifications or I don't know what else was there, like being app-like, that's really nice to have, and it gives your user a better experience. But if you want to tick boxes, this is the thing that you really need to have. So then what about Angular? How many of you are Angular developers here? That's about 30% of the room, I think, or maybe 40%, which is not bad. So with Angular, as with any of the React or Vue, you can actually use the CLI to create or to make your application a progressive web app. And with the Angular CLI, we can generate service workers. And the way to do that is basically just running ng-new dream app and adding the -- service worker flag. And what this will do in our Angular CLI configuration file, it will add this service worker property and set it to true. And what this will tell is basically, take my configuration file and generate a service worker from that. But then in our app module, we're going to also import the service worker module, which is basically a re-implementation in Angular of the service worker. And then we're going to register that using our service worker. And we're going to enable that for production environment, because we don't want to run service workers in our development environment, right? Because that means that we're going to get maybe cached content, and that's not what we want. And then in our NGSW config file, this is where we're actually configuring our service worker. And it's just like a declarative way of defining service workers. And we can configure things like what's our index file, and which are the assets that we're going to cache, and what's the strategy for caching them. So we can specify things like we're going to make sure that we are caching things like the index.html file immediately, and that's the pre-fetch install mode. And we can also define a lazy install mode, which means that we're going to make sure that we're going to cache that later, as well as an update mode, where we're saying when we're updating the data, when new data is available, do you want to cache that immediately or like, when you have time? So then we go ahead and build for production. And this is what gets generated, and these are our service workers. And then, because I'm a huge fan of gamification, I just went ahead and, okay, let's test this. Let's see with our Lighthouse plugin, let's see what score does my progressive web app get. And here we're going to get scores for like progressive web app, best practices, accessibility, and also performance. So what do you think? My app is going to be super progressive? No. It's actually sad news, because we're only 55% progressive. And our performance is not that great, but we're doing good for accessibility and best practices. So that's insane. Let's have a look at the details. What has happened there? Well, the first thing is that we don't have, if JavaScript is not enabled, nothing happens. Our user is going to see a white screen. They're not going to understand what has happened there. So there's a super easy solution here. We can add a no-script tag and just say there that, oh, we need JavaScript. But then we can also be a bit more fancy and actually start kind of define what's our app shell, and that would be things like what's the navigation, because that almost never changes, right? And what's the layout of our application. So we can actually do that and always send that over the wire. Another issue there was the fact that our application didn't redirect to HTTPS. And what I did was I immediately deployed the application to Microsoft Azure. And then here we have a on-off button, which immediately enables HTTPS traffic. And you're going to have this with almost all the cloud providers. And you're going to be able to do this with the push of a click, and that's perfectly easy to fix. Another issue, which kind of makes sense, right, is the fact that we didn't define the manifest.json file. For some reason, I kind of assumed that the Angular CLI is going to do that for me, or maybe I was just overly excited about building this. But then I immediately figured out that we have this tool called PWA Builder, and I can go there and generate, if I don't know how to build a manifest.json file, I can go there and just generate a new one. And I can also download it and just import it back to my application, and that's what I did. And ta-da! We have a 91% progressive web app. That's good news, right? But that's not 100%. So we have to fix this. And it's actually easy. It tells me that there's no meta tag with our theme color. So I just need to add this to our index.html file, and this is amazing. This is good news. This is great. Woohoo! But then you're going to say, but Simona, I actually have already an Angular app, and I'm super, super happy to go ahead right now and make my application progressive. What do I need to do? Well, we need to add the service worker package to our application, and we can do that easily with npm. And then we need to enable the service worker build support in the CLI. And remember, we had that property in the Angular CLI.json file where we just set that to true. And then we need to import and register our service worker in our module file. And finally, we need to create the service worker config file. And that's pretty much everything. So then, you've already seen that we have some tools. I've used some tools. And one of them is the Lighthouse, which is available in the Chrome DevTools, but it's also available as a CLI. And you can integrate the tests that you're running with your Lighthouse in your CI process. And so you can continuously check whether your application is still a progressive web app or if something really bad has happened when someone has checked in new code. PWA Builder, it helps you not only generate new manifest file or build service workers, but it also helps you kind of look at other people's manifest files. So if you think, like, for example, the angular.io application is doing a great job at building a progressive web app, you can enter the URL there, and it will actually give you the entire manifest.json file, and it will also give you some recommendations based on the contents of that. Workbox is a generic, like, JavaScript toolbox that will give you ways to handle offline caching and offline analytics. So if you're not using Angular and your framework doesn't provide something out of the box, you can use Workbox for that. Or even if you're using any of that, you can still use it, but you have to implement, for example, the lifecycle methods yourself. Pinterest has worked a lot on progressive web apps, and they have these packages that help you build progressive web apps. And one of the most interesting ones is the service worker mock package, because actually it creates a way for us to test our service workers. And that's one of the main issues with service workers. They're really hard to follow, and they mess up with your development environment. So then if you have, with this package, we actually get to test our application, and that's great. And finally, the Hacker News PWA kind of collection of applications is just kind of a set of projects that show you how to implement the Hacker News app using different frameworks like Angular, React, Vue, using best practices. And it's really cool to just have a look at what they've done and what kind of times they've achieved it and what kind of performance that they've achieved. And obviously, the Angular CLI can help you get started, as well as the Vue CLI and the Create React CLI. And I just have 2 success stories, but obviously there's more than 2. The first one is the Pinterest one. So Pinterest realized that they wanted to kind of reach an international audience, and most of the traffic comes from mobile, and their mobile experience wasn't great. So they've improved their app, and you can find a really good study here from Adi Osmani, where you can find details of everything that they've improved, but they focused on improving performance and making this an enjoyable experience for their users. Same as Flipkart. You can find the case study on the developers.google.com page, and what they managed to do is improve their conversion rate, I think, on mobile to 70% by just making their application progressive. So users enjoyed more using this shopping e-commerce application. The thing I want to leave you with is that progressive web apps are awesome, and they're a new way to deliver amazing user experiences on the web. So it's kind of, I would get to work on my stuff. And so would everyone else. So thank you.